Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Debs Grayson. I work for the Media Reform Coalition, and a very warm welcome to this afternoon session on creating a People's Channel 4. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please do check out the rest of the Media Democracy festival events on mediareform.org.uk. You can also see all of the previous events that have already happened this week up on our YouTube. The entire festival is free, but if you'd like to donate towards running costs, there's a donate button on our homepage. We will be hearing from each of our speakers, and then we will be having a Q&A. So do ask any questions on the platforms that you're watching on, and try and keep those questions clear and brief so we can cover as many as possible. And please do interact with the festival on socials using hashtag MDF22 and tag @MediaReformUK. Finally, a thank you to World Citizens London for promoting our ticket link. So today's session on creating a People's Channel 4 is part of the Media Reform Coalition's BBC and Beyond campaign, which I coordinate. This campaign has been running since the beginning of 2021, and we spent a lot of last year speaking to dozens of individuals and organisations and running a series of public events which engaged 30,000 people. And out of these conversations, we have created a manifesto for a people's media, which is our vision of a media fit to face the challenges of the future. We argue in this manifesto that what we need to do is create a media commons. This is an idea that we explored more in an excellent event that we had on Wednesday evening, and which is up on YouTube if you missed it. Our vision for this commons would contain a thriving ecology of independent media, people's newsrooms, community radio stations, digital innovators, and it would also contain our transformed public broadcasters, a People's BBC. There will be an event this evening at 7 p.m. talking more about what a People's BBC is, and then also a People's Channel 4, which is what we're going to be focusing on this afternoon. Channel 4 has a unique history and place in the UK's media ecology. Unlike ITV or Channel 5, it is publicly owned and not for profit, so it can focus on its public service remit. And unlike the BBC, it isn't reliant on government for funding, and its news and current affairs are often noticeably better at holding the government to account than the BBC's. It also has a unique role as a publisher broadcaster, which commissions all of its content from external production houses, and it has played a major role in creating the TV and film industries that we see in the UK today. Channel 4 is popular and broadly loved, but it is also under great pressure. There is the threat of privatisation, and I'm sure our speakers will talk about the negative impacts of privatisation if that was to go ahead. We've also seen government interference in appointments, for example, refusing to renew the terms for Uzma Hussain and Fru Hazlitt last year. Channel 4 now has an entirely white board. We are also seeing commercial pressures, and these are intensifying as TV advertising goes into decline. This means less money being spent on news and current affairs, less willingness to take risks, more generic reality TV programs, and occasionally really harmful ratings-chasing programs like Benefit Street and The Truth About Traveller Crime. Our manifesto is really about trying to have a positive vision for the media that we do want, rather than just focusing on the problems with what we have. So we have a vision for a People's Channel 4. This would be one which in many ways returns to its roots, with a strengthened remit to serve young people, minority audiences, and invest in innovation. It would be completely independent from government. There would be no government involvement in appointments, and it would be protected long-term from the threat of privatisation. It would also be radically devolved and democratised. We think that most decisions on budgets and commissioning should be made at the level of the English regions and devolved nations, and there should be new avenues for citizens to participate, for example, by electing people to regional and national boards, or there could be citizen juries to help set priorities and oversee news coverage, or even directly being involved in commissioning for at least some of the budget. These are just some of the ideas that we have, and it's a kind of outline of what a People's Channel 4 could be. And to explore these ideas further, we have a brilliant panel of speakers joining us today. So we have Ahmed Jamal, a documentary filmmaker, formerly with Channel 4's Independent Film and Video Department. We have Rod Stoneman, former Deputy Commissioning Editor in the Independent Film and Video Department. And we have Tom Morton, lead campaigner at We Own It. So each of them is going to speak for between kind of 8 to 12 minutes, and then we will come together for discussion and to answer your questions. Ahmed, do you want to kick us off?
Hello, everyone. I feel privileged to be here. I'll start off by just our own personal experience with Channel 4, and then as I go on, I'll end with what I think is happening with Channel 4 now and how our own experience as Black and Asian people and independent producers, how we see it going forward. So I'll begin with our first interaction with Channel 4, which was very much around the time Channel 4 was formed. I think it was 1982, when we formed Retake Film and Video, which was one of the first Asian or Black collectives to be franchised under the Workshop Declaration. And we were funded by the GLC, Greater London Arts, and the newly formed Race Unit at Camden Council. And of course, one of our main funders was Channel 4 through the Independent Film and Video Department, under the late and wonderful Alan Fountain, of course, Rod Stoneman and Caroline Spry. Retake was supported till 1988 by the Independent Film and Video Department, when, to my surprise, it was felt that we were sufficiently experienced enough to get commissioned by other departments of Channel 4. As I was told by Jeremy Isaacs, during the London Film Festival, where we received the BFI's award for independent film in 1988. So we split into two limited companies, I mean the collective itself. One owned by my brother Mahmood, the late brother, who died of COVID last year, and called Epic Flow, and he made lots of programs for the multicultural department of Channel 4. And the other was run by myself, First Take Limited, which has continued to make human stories that were socio-political and revelatory, and later observational films, and it's still in existence. As a workshop, we produced Majdar, our first film for Channel 4, one of the first independent feature films set in the Asian community, again shown on, I think, on the 11th hour at Channel 4. And later we did a drama on homelessness funded by Shelter, which was shown on BBC Two, unusually, which might have been the first time for a workshop. Channel 4's annual report of 1985, which somebody sent me recently, mentions Majdar, our Asian feature film, with a still from it. And our film, Who Will Cast the First Stone, about the effect of Islamic laws on women in Pakistan, was shown on Channel 4 and at the London Film Festival, as were the other two. Many of our other films were a response to the local Asian and Black and minority communities in Camden, and were shown on Channel 4, such as films on racism, council flats, Black elderly, and an ongoing sanctuary in a Greek Cypriot church in Camden. But as a commercial company, First Take started making longer form documentaries dealing in depth with many international subjects in the subcontinent, but also in the Middle East. It is almost unthinkable for that now, as it is considered the domain of mainstream journalists, which is why we get so many international stories wrong. And it was the foresight and the desire to disrupt the mainstream narrative that Channel 4 allowed us to do in those days. Films which were shown on a 9 p.m. slot and under the Critical Eye slot was Iran, the Other Story, about the history of Iran, about the history of the left in Iran. And then Kurdistan, the Lost Colony, which again, actually Alan asked me to make because he was interested in the Kurds on the streets giving out leaflets. And later on, we did some work for the multicultural department and made an observational film called Dead Man Talking, which was shown at 9 p.m. in the year 1999, I think, or 2000, about a police investigation into a murder in Hampshire, which took 2 years or so to make, as the case became sub judice. And Peter Salmon, the controller at the time, said this was the sort of program Channel 4 should be doing more of, in an interview to Broadcast Magazine. Again, we did something for the independent film video department later on called The Fundamental Question about the Arabs who fought in Afghanistan and the impact of their return to their home countries after the end of the Russian occupation, and the impact these radicalized religious warriors were having on the politics and societies in those countries such as Algeria, Egypt, Bosnia, etc., and in the West. At that time, at least Channel 4 till early 90s had these kind of films and subjects at the heart of its programming. But it all started changing to some extent as soon as Jeremy Isaacs left. The remit of the channel was mostly fulfilled by the independent film video department, I think, after that, and the multicultural department. But the rest of the channel was moving much more mainstream. It is interesting that these were the first two departments which were shut down, and the kind of programs they made discontinued. This was particularly devastating, not only for Asian and Black-owned production companies, but to other producers who are interested in making more challenging, socially and politically active programs. Most of the Black and Asian-owned companies no longer exist. The importance of those companies was that many people who work and have made a name for themselves in television and broadcasting were given opportunities by these Black and Asian companies, which were commissioned by Channel 4 and to some extent by BBC. Since most of them stopped getting any work from Channel 4, new talent from a diverse background became a rarity until now, when there's a recognition that there is a serious problem with TV, film, and broadcasting with representation. The tokenism of Black and Asian presenters on television appears to be very inclusive, but it hides the fact that behind the camera and the people in commissioning or management remain hideously white, to quote Greg Dyke. Despite many programs for both the BBC and Channel 4, which were continuously pick of the day, the week, or even month in many mainstream papers and magazines, many of the Black and Asian companies found that work just dried up. Whereas the trajectory of white producers, or generally in getting ahead and being given greater opportunities, continues and continuous commissions, is completely different from the Asian or Black experience. So that is the background of our experience of working with Channel 4, which was as an organization that listened and responded to the changing multiracial society that Britain had become. As small indies, we were able to get access to a degree of opportunities, though it was not easy even then. There were still many hurdles to cross. But things have changed drastically, and so I feel I need to put down some thoughts on how, as an Asian filmmaker and producer, I see where people like myself stand with regards to Channel 4 today, under the threat of privatization looming over its head. Channel 4 came into being, I think, 1982, and was instituted by an act of parliament with a remit to represent on TV that which is not represented elsewhere. This was an act of parliament which recognized the fact that there were swathes of the population which constituted new dimensions of thought and action. The new communities, Black and Asian, feminism, gay people, the dimensions of disability, etc. These were large headings. I think it was the genius of the first chief executive, Jeremy Isaacs, who enlarged this remit to include, for instance, sports, which were not represented on the BBC or ITV. It was a right-wing Thatcher government which instituted the channel. Why? The legend is that Thatcher herself was skeptical about launching such a channel. She didn't want protests in left-wingish views to join the national conversation. It was reputedly Willie Whitelaw, the Home Secretary, who persuaded her that the messages the channel championed were not important. The channel would be the hub of small capitalist enterprise. Producers would hire and fire as necessary to make programs. This would be a free enterprise channel and undermine the unions which had built up power in the BBC and ITV. I think it proved prophetically is correct. Channel 4 soon selling its own advertising and commanding much more money and budgets than it had when it was a financial subsidiary of the ITV, became an essential and dynamic part of the national conversation. So many programs, films, and initiatives, including the multicultural and film output. Then I think at the turn of the millennium came the vast expansion of TV, scores, and then hundreds of channels became transmitting in Britain. There was a scramble for audiences figures. Numbers were all, because they determined who would advertise where. Channel 4 answered the challenge in a predictable way. It went down market in its programming, and its editorial freshness, discovery, and innovation were undermined by statistical departments, producing algorithms for which programs would attract substantial, large audiences. In hindsight, that commercial pressure was the central factor in the betrayal of the remit, even though the apologists within manage all manners of logical sophistry to try and interpret the least appropriate programs as within the boundaries of the remit. The other factor which inevitably contributes to this drift away from the remit is the fact that the channel has no new and obvious identifiable movements, dimensions, or voices to represent. But is that true? A dynamic editorial team with appropriate inspired leadership, the only way to avoid it becoming just another commercial channel with no justification for it not being privatized, would set itself the task of interpreting the original remit and applying it without commercial considerations to discovering or uncovering the new phenomena, voices, and dimensions that Britain and the world undoubtedly, inevitably contain. There are new formations and communities in Britain that need a voice. There are new genres of fiction and drama to explore. This is undoubtedly a massive dimension of there's undoubtedly a massive dimension of investigative journalism that awaits exploiting. The channel has, in its multicultural remit, drifted into insistent tokenism. As I said, mentioned before, black faces on screen tick boxes, but that's not the first 17 years of the channel as it was. It delved in every TV genre and forms into the lives of the new communities. If the remit of familiarity and insight had been followed, the nation would not have been surprised that 5 young female schoolgirls traveling to Syria to become jihadi brides. If that remit of familiarity and insight had been followed, we would have program after program from within the Black community with indications of how to tackle and end the gang killings, the knifing and shooting of the young that are a scandal in this country. If that remit were to be followed, we would know more about the obscure networks of Islamic terror delusions and how it spreads and takes hold. We would know that the lives and fate of the European workers who remain here after Brexit. We would hold Uncle Boris's cabinet to strictly factual and well-argued account without facing Nadine Dorris's threat of cancelling the license fee. Thank you. That's about what I have to say at the moment. And I'm sorry I had to read some of it because I'm not too good at extempore speaking. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ahmed. That was brilliant. Rod, do you want to come in?
I will. Thank you and the organisers for inviting me to discuss this. When on a previous occasion, the 25th anniversary of Channel 4, actually, there was conference at the BFI South Bank in NFT2, I remember talking along these lines, and there was a report in the screen accusing me of nostalgia. Well, I'm open to wistfulness and longing, or even melancholia sometimes. But the motive for talking about early Channel 4 is surely not nostalgia. It's much more interesting to think how the visions and the first principles and the practice of early Channel 4 is relevant to the present predicament, which doesn't mean that one would replicate things, but that it might inform debate which moved on and mobilized new versions of television and the audiovisual in Britain. I mean, obviously, I'm very conscious it's an entirely new situation has evolved. History has taken place, and this is not the same starting point as it was in 1982. But in that epoch, I have to say we were it was exhilarating and extraordinary, but we didn't think that we'd gotten it right. We actually were quite frustrated by the limitations and containment in our aspirations and hopes of what could be done with television. And I had fully expected when I left 10 years later in about 93, I imagined that new generations would build on and surpass the kind of work we had done. Sad to say that's not, by and large, been true, but we'll talk about the present situation later. To describe some of the activities that Ahmed has touched on in independent film and video, which was the department with Alan Fountain led, Caroline Spry joined a couple of years later. I'll go through some of that and then try and arrive at some of the underlying principles. Obviously, the channel as a whole had a formal and legal remit to extend the range of programs available to British audiences and to innovate, is the verb, to innovate in the form and content of programs, which was a very enlightened and helpful remit to start from. And our department began with the 11th hour at that time on Monday nights, and shorter seasons of people to people and access program that I'll come back to. The 11th hour configured mixtures of programs, by and large. Sometimes there were singles, but by and large there'd be clusters of programs around ideas or themes, comprising political documentaries, personal and political documentaries, low budget fiction, experiment, what we used to call the avant-garde, strange delvings called radical form, which probably summarized in the words Jean-Luc Godard or Kluger or Makabayev or Straub-Huillet, where basically something radical to be articulated took a different form, as in not standard television narrative, to articulate it. That area was not as successful as one thought it might be, but some very good work from Britain and further afield took place there. We also were involved in quite a lot of programming and production, co-production with what was then called the Third World. Seasons like Africa on Africa, or New Cinema Latin America, or Vietnam cinema, for example. So across a number of years, we were putting together seasons from the global south in different ways. And then eventually there was a Sunday night slot for about 10 o'clock for about 3/4 of the year, called Cinema of Three Continents, which did just program individual films, some of which we had bought when they were made, some of which we co-produced and helped them get made. In terms of sexual politics, gay and lesbian programs, In the Pink as a season, followed by a number of actual series of Out on Tuesday, and with Paul Madden media shows, like, originally Vision Cinema, and at a later stage, the media show, looking at film and television and other media. It was only a small part of our work, but we even did some extremely out there stuff around ideas. There was a series, the late Patricia Llewellyn put together a series called Talking Liberties, where a number of great philosophers of our time were giving talks at Oxford at an Amnesty International series. And also, actually, in a moment of complete mischief, I managed to buy 3 talks by Jacques Lacan, the almost opaque French psychoanalyst and philosopher, and put that on at 1:30 in the morning. And to indeed, my amazement, there were 125,000 people that wanted to watch it, apparently, probably taxi drivers and Annalise Anns, but that was just pushing the boundaries a little bit in that direction. A lot of this work was supported by a network of workshops. There were 12 to 15 workshops around Britain. Ahmed Jamal just mentioned Retake. There were 2 other Black workshops, Sankofa and Black Audio, but also workshops in many different forms and types around Britain, supported by a particular progressive union agreement by ACTT Film Union. I mean, recently, if I have time to digress, recently there was an exhibition that Sarah Griavu put together in Limerick and in Dublin on the Derry Film and Video Workshop. And I'm just focusing on that because their experience actually is so contemporary and relevant now. People who had not been to film school and not had formal filmmaking training did an excellent low-budget fiction called Hushabye Baby, where a young girl gets pregnant. Also, a documentary which turned out to be extremely controversial. It was called Mother Ireland. It was a debate between feminism and republicanism. The controversy wasn't about having an intelligent program on such matters. It was the fact that Mairead Farrell had been interviewed for it, a very articulate commentary inside in the interview she did. But before the program was transmitted, she was killed in a particularly brutal and aggressive and illegal way by the SAS at Gibraltar. And so therefore to show a program by this woman, to show a program with an interview with this woman became a big issue, though Channel 4 eventually managed to show it in a program that John Willis put together with the marvelous title of Banned, B-A-N-N-E-D. And so we said, look, we've got this program that's been banned, so why don't we put that in? And guess what happened? Nothing, of course, but there'd been a huge anticipation of hoo-ha. But Michael Graves actually, but by the way, I think that I have to say, Ahmed, I don't completely agree with this narrative, Isaac's good, great, bad. It's a much more complex series of factors that fed into the change of British television as a whole, let alone Channel 4, but maybe we'll come back to that later. Workshops, a key aspect of supporting the workshops was the concept of direct speech, that one should minimize the amount of mediation and enable people to speak directly for themselves. And the workshops and other, I have inverted commas around the word professional, but professional filmmakers worked with communities of interest in a way that enabled something like direct speech to take place. And actually, in a way, I would even say feature films from Burkina Faso or from Bolivia are direct speech, a better sense of how the world looks from those other parts of it. This is all part of a sort of notion of radical pluralism, whereby the unspoken can be on television, and there's a way in which the range of unrepresented material takes a dialogue with different parts of the spectrum within a pluralist spectrum within a notion of the underrepresented. I think it's important to say that what I've been saying about independent film and video was in the context of the rest of Channel 4's innovation, that Film on 4 obviously had a big effect on the British film industry. Brookside as a soap was actually shot in a house estate. I'm not so interested in sport, but if one was, there was American football for the first, even the Tour de France for the first time, and indeed sumo wrestling, giving an insight into Japanese culture, I guess. Channel 4 News, it was longer and better, and it was supplemented by argumentation from opinions and other areas of programming like Bandung File from the Fruit Dondi in the multicultural department, the Friday Alternative coming through Current Affairs, a lot of different extensions to the spectrum, the innovation of the spectrum. And indeed, if we're playing Russian dolls, you know, our department within Channel 4 in relation to British television that had what BBC doing Ways of Seeing by John Berger, or Stuart Hall talking about the spectre of Karl Marx, etc. I mean, you know, that was a much wider and better context. And indeed, you could even say European television, because I think the 11th Hour partially comes from Das Klein's Fernsehspiel on ZDF. I better speed along, but to flash forward to the present, there's not much of this around at the moment. I mean, there's sort of radicals on television, but generally individual punditry coming and going. And in thinking about this session, I remembered how extraordinary it was for Jon Snow at his MacTaggart talk at the Edinburgh TV Festival in 2017, to say the impact that going to Grenfell Towers had on him, when very angry and recriminatory locals said, "But you never were interested, you never came here," when we'd been arguing about the issues of the towers and cladding here and elsewhere. And Jon Snow was saying, the truth is, broadcasting is run by an elite that has very little contact with the full range of communities that make up Britain at the moment. I wouldn't say that, you know, our epoch of Channel 4 or stuff in our department had the answer, but it had a much better chance of doing that work, in that, for example, during the miners' strike, there was long Channel 4 News trying to really make sense of it. And the workshops had already, in mining communities, some of those regional workshops had already worked with those communities to, I remember rumours of the miners' fortnight from Wales, or trade and amber up in Newcastle, giving a sense of the perspective of mining communities. The workshops were there and could do that. There is a sense, just to try and finish, there is a sense that movements have coalesced and gathered impetus and used digital means like Me Too or BLM, Black Lives Matter, or you know, Extinction Rebellion. But that is not the same as properly funded production made in a public space, which would develop the impetus to have those arguments and in the longer term achieve hegemony. This year is the 40th anniversary of Channel 4, and in September there's a BFI South Bank season, and there's workshops at the ICA and regional events in Belfast and Bristol and Brighton, etc. I think it's very important that the channel has been supportive of this and is talking about a range of new programs to argue the toss about controversial issues. It would be easy to be cynical and preemptive, but I think that actually it's not just a question, oh, they did naked attraction, why expect anything? I think one needs to support the possibility of the channel reinventing its radical origins and approaching its 40th anniversary birthday, challenging conventional thinking and representing a wider range of unheard voices. Thank you very much. Sorry if I went on too long.
Thank you, Rod. Yeah, we're getting some great questions coming in, so please do keep contributing on the platforms. Tom, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thanks, Debs. And yeah, thanks for having me on this webinar today. It's been really good to listen to Rod and Ahmed speak. I was born in the 90s, so I don't, I don't remember. I never experienced this Channel 4 that you're both talking about, with like this real risk-taking, innovative content. And yeah, and I think that the point you made, Rod, about putting Stuart Hall and Jacques Lacan on it in the middle of the night to 100,000 taxi drivers is what a great thing that is. And it seems sort of unbelievable to me now that there would be a mainstream TV channel that would do that. My name's Tom. I'm the lead campaigner at We Own It on Channel 4, on our work pushing back against Channel 4 privatisation. For anybody who doesn't know us, We Own It is a campaigning organisation for tens of thousands of public service users across the UK. And yeah, our work at the moment has been pushing back against the government's proposals to sell Channel 4 into private hands, essentially. And so I guess the first point to make is why it's important for us to have publicly owned media companies as part of our kind of media landscape in this country. I think the issue that we have is that some people say I'm cynical, but I've had members of the party of government tell me this directly, so I don't think I am. I think the issue that we have is that there's been a trend now across successive governments from different parties of believing that competitive market principles should be applied to every single sector of our society, that the private sector should run everything. And this is true from, public transport to healthcare, and the media landscape is no different to that. We've had Tory politicians respond to our supporters when they've written to them about Channel 4 privatisation, saying straightforwardly that they don't think the state should own a TV channel. So the people who accuse me of being cynical, yeah, I mean, they've written it down for us. So yeah, there's no question about what it is that they actually think, regardless of what it is that they might say on TV. And obviously this has been going on for decades now, and it's now at the point where, even moving past the attacks on the BBC by the government, that now it's reached Channel 4, and there is serious talk about selling it, and the government is still doesn't really seem to have budged on its position on that. So what does the government say that the issue is? It says that Channel 4 can't compete economically with online streaming platforms, and that it needs to be able to access private money, private capital, to be able to continue competing. I don't think that's true. I think that Channel 4, if you take the last year as an example, is a profitable company. It's running something like a 70 million quid pre-tax surplus. It's got 200 million quid in reserve, and a lot of the growth that Channel 4 has had has been in digital. So it's not that Debs obviously made the point at the beginning about the decline of TV advertising, and of course that's true. But yeah, a lot of Channel 4's growth has come from digital recently, and not from its TV advertising. So I think that actually the opposite point is true, is that putting Channel 4 into the hands of a private owner actually creates a financial pressure for Channel 4. I think that right now, as a not-for-profit organisation, of course, Channel 4 can't lose money, but it doesn't have to give any of that money to shareholders, to line shareholders' pockets, Whereas in private hands, of course, that's exactly what a private enterprise would aim to do, because that's what they do. They're for-profit enterprises. So why is it important that Channel 4 doesn't have that economic pressure? Well, at the moment, as a not-for-profit organisation, Channel 4 can take risks. And I thought that the points that Rod and Ahmed have made were really interesting about how, yeah, already the commercial pressure that is built into the Channel 4 model was kind of inevitably going to pull it away from its remit. And I think that's really interesting, and hopefully something that we can come back to in the Q&A after this. But not having to generate, a profit for shareholders, not having to stick money in shareholders' pockets, it does mean that Channel 4 can take risks. And I don't just mean cultural risks. Like I say, the having, philosophers talking for an hour on TV in the middle of the night is probably something that looks quite risky to a private owner. But I mean economic risks as well. And I think that the work that we can point to that Channel 4 has done building outside of London and working with, I think it's something like 140 small to medium enterprises in those in the production companies in its production line. Those are exactly the type of risks that we're talking about. They work with more indie producers than any other broadcaster in the country. They create more media jobs outside of London than any other broadcaster in the country as well. And those are risks that you can take if you're not worried about, if you're not worried about keeping your shareholders happy by sticking money in their pockets, essentially. And I think that's something that, if we are ever going to have a chance of having a media landscape that can take those risks culturally as well, that has to be a bottom line. There has to be we can't take a step backwards on this as an issue, because if we are going to push for the kind of things that the Media Reform Coalition are talking about, which, our organisation, We Own It, broadly agrees with, and, some of the cultural steps backwards that the speakers on this panel have been referring to, then keeping Channel 4 in public hands is absolutely crucial. It's number one. And of course, when we're talking about like jobs outside of London, I've had some people try and suggest to me when I've been talking to, people who are not necessarily on our side that we're talking about, wealthy entertainers' jobs. But of course we're not. We're talking about people who work on sets. So, electricians, set painters, people who work in offices at these production companies. These are decent media positions. And the creative hubs outside of London, so in Bristol and in Glasgow, we've seen that the potential that those have to actually strengthen that remit by working with kind of young people, particularly targeted at areas of social deprivation. In Bristol, I know that's certainly true where I'm based, that the Creative Hub has already started working with youth organisations in the city. And that's just an example of like why we need to hold on to these as strategic assets going forward. There's things that we can point to that could be working better than they are right now. And if we're going to take those steps forward, we absolutely need to hold on to those assets rather than letting them slip out of our hands now. But of course, this isn't just a fight against privatisation. We Own It have always made a case for forward-facing public ownership. We don't want to be here making a case about, just taking things back into public hands, keeping things in public hands and keeping them the way that they are. We want to be talking about what the future of public ownership is going to look like in this country. And the main things that we focus on are precisely democratisation of public services. We're an organisation of public service users, and we think as public service users, we should have a say in what those services look like and how we interact with them. And as part of that democratisation, we want to have conversations about how those public services can be devolved to our, not just the nations in the UK, but into the regions outside of London. We don't want to just go back to a model of public ownership that's really top down and decisions are made somewhere far away in Westminster. And when there's something wrong with a public service, as is the situation now, there's very little we can do as public service users to do anything about it, really. It's not just a fight against privatisation, it's a fight for what the future of public services are going to look like. I think that risk-taking aspect, that culturally risk-taking aspect, that economically risk-taking aspect is something that we are going to need if we're going to meet the challenges that are facing us right now. Yeah, like I said, the point that Rod made about the kind of content, and that Ahmed made about the kind of content that used to be on there, people can be surprised by what they might like on TV. And one of the things that does bother me on a personal level is how often that commercial pressure, that need to run a profit, forces content to this kind of lowest common denominator content that we're told that's what people will like. Well, you know, we can be surprised by what we like. Do you know what I mean? We can see something that we would never go and seek out ourselves, and unexpectedly enjoy it. And there are people who would accuse that of being a paternalistic approach, that, you know, that we know what's good for people and that we know the kind of content that people need to see. But I think Rod made the point, right, that the broadcasting elite have never been further away from people. It's still those people who are deciding what we're going to see. But what they're deciding we're going to see is, this very like lowest common denominator stuff that they think is going to appeal to a mass audience. So that's precisely why we need public services closer to public service users. So we're broad. That's why we're always really keen to work with the Media Reform Coalition, and we have done on this campaign, because that work that MRC do, building what that vision can look like, is really crucial, and is going to be really crucial going forward. So what have we only done so far? So the situation we're in now with Channel 4 is that last year the government launched a consultation into what the public thought about a change in the ownership model of Channel 4. We're hearing from the press that around 60,000 consultation submissions were made, which is really good. And the strength of the pushback against a change of ownership has been massive. And what that has achieved so far is that the government keep kicking this decision down the road. We were supposed to hear something at the end of last year, and it's been kicked down the road. We were supposed to hear something at the end of January, and it hasn't materialized. Now, we've been speaking to people at Channel 4. We've been speaking to people in the government, in the party of government. And essentially, we're being told that everybody thought that there was going to be an announcement at the end of January. Advice has gone to ministers, so it sounds as though they've finished reading those consultation responses. And we're just waiting for what their response is going to be. And we're expecting some kind of policy paper, a white paper in government as part of a media bill. And that can include everything from, what their plans for the BBC are, to whether or not they're going to push ahead with a change of ownership for Channel 4. Like I said, the pushback against it has been massive. So We Own It alone, our supporters sent around almost 9,000 emails to individual MPs. And we've been able to identify groups of sympathetic Tory MPs who are willing to work with us on this. We've been working really closely with the trade unions who are affected and other campaigning organisations, as well as regional mayors, and have written publicly to Nadine Dorries about this. Unfortunately, the sympathetic Tory MPs who were on our side weren't willing to sign our letter, but they were willing to write their own letter that made very similar arguments to ours. So I think that's, they obviously want to put a bit of distance between us and them, but I think that's a positive step. And the other thing here is that the production companies have come out against it, as well as every single Scottish Tory MP has also come out against this sale. So the amount of pushback against this is massive, and there's a real chance for us to take this first step into taking the privatisation of Channel 4 off the table. And that, as I've said, is really the first step in pushing forward to a vision for Channel 4 for the future and what that can look like. So thank you for having me on this call, and I hope that we've got much more campaigning to do going forward.
Great, thank you, Tom. And I think you've answered there one of the questions that we had, saying how do we fight privatisation effectively? Doesn't Johnson have the mandate to do what he wants, including crushing his political opponents? I mean, yes, it is true that he has an 80-seat majority, but it is also true that his government is not really, it is also quite dysfunctional. And what we have seen is that things can be delayed, things can be pushed back, and things may well be dropped if it's made difficult enough for them to do the things that they want to do. And I think the mobilization against the privatisation of Channel 4 has been a good example of that so far. Okay, so yeah, thank you all so much for your contributions. I think that's been a really great start to the conversation. I think it would be good to start with some of these questions. There's a question around, I think exploring more about this, how democratization can really work. So there's a question here saying, did Channel 4 ever experiment with involving the public in its commissioning decisions, as well as into production via the workshops? What do the panel think about how this could be done? And also asking whether there are ways, aside from viewing figures, that Channel 4 use those things to try and find out what audiences thought of its programs. And I guess, maybe Tom, you could talk a little bit more about the way that We Own It have talked about 21st century public ownership and how that can work practically. And if Rod and Ahmed, you have any insights on what has been done in the past, or things that I'm really interested to hear you say, Rod, that, you weren't super satisfied actually with the early years of Channel 4 at the time. So maybe there were things that you wanted to try, or things that you thought would become like part of the future of Channel 4, and whether any of those ideas are still kind of, it's not just that they are, it's possible to pick them back up. Digital technologies actually make a whole bunch of kind of interaction and feedback much more possible than it was in the 80s and 90s. So yeah, I don't know who wants to respond to that first. Rod?
I mean, I actually think this is a exciting exploration, but it's a large and complex and delicate process about how power is structured, how programs are made. I mean, I very carefully said direct speech, where professional program makers collaborate with non-professional program makers and together fashion something that both of those parties are happy with, and indeed seems worth taking some airtime for. It's questions of democracy and people. The word peoples is thrown around quite a lot, are complicated and not a simple one of let's have a democratic television station, but it's certainly an area for further thought and development. I mean, just looking at the questions coming through on chat, there are another couple relevant. One was, did Channel 4 take audience feedback at all seriously, leaving aside audience figures? There was a thing called the duty log, which had everyone who rang in summarized, their phone call was summarized, and obviously there was a lot of sort of telephone trees and craziness. It was very effective. I mean, commissioning editors are responsive to stuff in the media and people ringing in and stuff. I mean, actually, jokingly, if I'm being permitted this, at program review discussions where 10, 15 people would talk about the channel's output each week, people often, I thought, were most influenced by that very same Lacan interested group, taxi drivers, because they'd always be in taxi. People say, well, what do you do for a job? And they say, oh, I work for Channel 4. Oh, well, I saw this program. And this stuff would be quoted. But, there are clearly more serious routes for input from communities, separate to, say, workshops based in the community. And if I can just finish by saying a third question up there about the world of streaming. You're absolutely right. This whole terrain is changing very, very fast and was further sped up by the process of the pandemic. And the issue is, of course, not whether something is on a streaming possibility or on YouTube already, but how people know about it, how people who have watched this hour have actually heard about it to start with. And that's a very serious issue. Marketing, not programming or curating by algorithm, but marketing to individuals and communities in a way that opens up the range of possibilities and what can be viewed. And I don't think we've really been thinking about that very much so far.
Ahmed, did you have thoughts? Oh, Tom, come in.
Oh no, if there was a direct response, then I'm happy to wait. I was just going to come in on the point you asked me to speak about 21st century public ownership, but if we want to stay on streaming for a second, I'm happy to do that. No? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think Rod's absolutely right. You know, this is a massive question that's in the 5-10 minutes we have left. We're probably not going to be able to map out extensively, but I think there are a few kind of principles that can be taken as a kind of route forward. Essentially, for us, We Own It made a document, published a document called When We Own It, which was precisely this, laying out what 21st century public ownership means to us and why we don't talk about renationalizing or nationalization. We talk about public ownership. And there's a few kind of key principles. One is making public services local, regional, and regional as well as national. So at the moment, public services can be quite there's some public services that are top down from the national level, and then whilst there are some that do have kind of regional decision making bodies and local decision making bodies, we think that's a really key starting point for a kind of genuine kind of public control and public ownership. And the second thing to bear in mind, the second principle to bear in mind going forward, is that there needs to be a kind of political will and an openness to create new structures to ensure the success of public participation in public services. So these are like we can think of these as kind of new forums, new decision-making bodies, and new positions on there as well. And the aim of this really is to maximise two things. One is participation, and the other is accountability. And that's why we think that it's not just about consultation. It's not just about kind of collaboration where we get people's opinions and feedback and complaints and comments and so on. There needs to be some kind of representation as well, and that's why one of the principles is creating new structures to ensure this. There needs to be a way for public service users regionally and locally to have a voice, a representative voice that is accountable, and that's really the key way to putting the public in ownership. And so we see these, obviously, again, this is a big conversation, and I don't want to sit here and draw out a really prescriptive map of what that could look like. But we'd be looking at kind of working with people like the trade unions and frontline workers who work in these public services, who work at places like Channel 4, but also public representatives locally and regionally who can have a seat at the table of these conversations and are accountable for the decisions that get made in these organisations. So that's some very top level principles that we think of as 21st century public ownership. And rather than sitting here and trying to map that all out, I think I'll just leave it there.
I think there's something so powerful as well about imagining that in the context of a broadcaster like Channel 4, partly because I just feel like there's something potentially exciting about participating in a television channel in a way that could actually illustrate for people what it means to participate in a public service. There's a certain kind of person who will get involved in running, how the trains run, or how the sewage system works, or how the water system works. And I know you recognise in that report, it's not going to be everybody. Maybe the kind of person that would want to be involved in Channel 4 might be more appealing to young people. It might be more appealing, especially if it's got this specific remit to serve young people, to serve minority groups. There will be a way that could be a way of showing people the benefits of getting involved in running public services. Ahmed, I wonder if you want to come back on that, or there was a specific question for you as well. But come in.
I just think because, as Rod said, things are so complicated now with the fragmentation of the audience. It's up to Channel 4 to sort of demonstrate to us why we need it as a public service provider. For example, many people, I mean, in our own communities, like the Asian community, many of them don't watch Channel 4 or the BBC. They get their the, the grandparents watch channels that are Indian or Pakistani or Middle Eastern or something. They hardly ever watch the BBC except when there's some major event. Um, the, and also because Channel 4 was more progressive, so a lot of people from our communities are slightly more conservative in their outlook on life, so they've avoided certain things on Channel 4. But it's all trying to be something for everybody. It's up to Channel 4 now to convince us that it should stay in public hands. I mean, it's a very complex thing, but at least they should convince other producers what benefit will they get? How can they get access apart from putting things into the hands of bigger and bigger companies? I'm not saying that the old model was the best, but there wasn't such a huge expense on management. There was huge buildings and places. It was more commissioning editors who had a kind of a vision or had an editorial view on life, and they would commission programs. It's not necessarily that they were all programs that were edgy and they were to do with minorities. There was it wasn't that was part of it, but through that came out some good stuff. But at the moment, it's like I feel personally that many of the commissioning editors you deal with, they're very hard to get to these days anyway. Also, you feel their managers, the decisions they're making are based on marketing or the commercial demands that they have on what can get commissioned. So I couldn't go up to Rod and talk to him and say, look, I've got this great idea for the story of this man in Camden. And he said, yeah, let's do it. Like we did this film on Kurdistan with Alan, saw some people a few times getting out of Good Street and Kurdish people giving out leaflets. He said, who are these guys? Because we had done this film on Iran. And he said, I'd like to make something on them. And we did. We did a film which was called Kurdistan, the Last Colony, about the whole history of Kurdistan. Quite slightly didactic, but at the 91 war in Iraq, it was sold almost everywhere in the world. So I hope I've made some sense there. But
Well, I also wondered if you wanted to come back on this question that was directed to you, saying, so you mentioned that mainstream journalists got several things wrong. Could you expand on that? Do you think we need different types of storytellers to tell the truth about society? That seems to connect with maybe some of the things you were just saying.
I absolutely think that we need, apart from the journalistic view of things, we do need what Rod was saying earlier and what the kind of stuff we were doing is getting stories told by people who live and experience those things, or at least have part of the community. They can feel it more. So you get better and more in-depth stories. I find, and I've done current affair stuff, like we did some stuff for Channel 4 News. When the Iraq War was on, in fact, we did this first thing on the Marsh Arabs, which nobody had covered at that time. And the head of Channel 4 in the Channel 4 News, Sue English, told me that she was asked that in the Foreign Office, that why has nobody covered the Marsh Arabs? And she said we did. So the way we did it was an Iranian photographer who went. We gave him a hired camera, and he went and filmed the Marsh Arabs, and that's how it came out. And also, I've had experience of journalists that I've seen they want to get on with the story. I had experience of I don't want to take names of a very prestigious program, something like Panorama, where a journalist told me, and I said, this is not too long ago, and he said, I said, this is wrong, factually wrong, and he says, well, Mrs. Smith in Hampshire won't know the difference. Anyway, we had an argument, and then the producer then changed it, and so I also felt that in the war in Afghanistan and in Syria and the Middle East, many times I felt slightly disappointed with the way it was being reported in the BBC and all the mainstream channels, in a sense. I felt there's something else you wanted to know, something more behind the scenes, something more on experiencing what people were experiencing. And that is slightly, it's just a demand of broadcasting now, I guess, that happens. But you feel that there aren't that many people who, for example, in the Middle East, I feel, apart from Robert Fisk, who always comes up with some deep insights, I feel that a lot of it is just superficial storytelling or reporting. This happened, that happened. It's like when the troubles with Northern Ireland, people are saying, "Oh, somebody got shot, somebody got killed, somebody did this, or Catholics did that, and the Protestants did this," but they didn't ever go into the depth and why that thing was there. So that came up with one of the groups that Alan funded, who did a movie called Acceptable Levels, and that gave a certain insight that was not there in mainstream chat.
Yeah, I would just to say, I mean, when I know I've already mentioned Michael Gray, one of the bids for privatisation might come from him apparently, but when he launched the magazine program after all the feature films from Cinema Three Continents and the seasons, we actually had a magazine program called South, which had
oh yes, we did something for that.
4 or 5 short pieces made by independent filmmakers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And quite wittily, Michael Gray at the launch said, most British television research on the Third World takes place in Terminal 3 of Heathrow Airport. And I think one understood his reference to parachute journalism. And the point is that to hear directly in whatever form will give different perspectives, will introduce diversity, and as Ahmed has mentioned very often, insight and enlightenment. And there has to be a way in which television can move more openly and take the basis of streaming as a way of doing it towards a greater diversity of voices. Because one of the points that John Snow made in that Edinburgh speech was, he said, if I've got the statistics right, 80% of the people working in higher management positions of British television went to public school, private school, in fact. On the other hand, 80% of the British public went to comprehensives or state schools. That's the inversion, which is leading to problems with perspective, to put it mildly. I went to public school, by the way.
Thanks for those responses. I'm just going to read through some of the final comments that we've got, and then I'll come back to each of you for your final thoughts. So you can basically pick a question or a comment that you want to respond to, or just say something else that you really want to contribute to the discussion. So we had a question for Ahmed about, do you find it difficult to have sympathy for the channel considering it's not as good as it once was? Would privatisation maybe make it more adventurous? There was a question for Rod saying, with all your experience, do you think there are possibilities for media to help support the arts and events sectors? After all this time, they need support, and media could easily be in person. Yeah, there was a question which you kind of covered, Rod, about Channel 4 has always looked to the US for TV shows, it seems. What are the hopes for British programming in the new world of streaming? And how would this be affected by privatisation? And yeah, some more questions about workshops, saying what kind of representation do people involved in the independent production workshops have inside Channel 4 itself in the early days? How did the channel's relationship with workshops develop over time? And yeah, I think I would just kind of say as well, it seems like there's a theme in some of the things that you're saying, and this is something that we've definitely tried to address in the manifesto, and we were particularly talking about in the session about a media commons on Wednesday, which is kind of the visionary possibilities of what media could be that that could come from different kinds of structures which allow more people, different kinds of voices, that could include things like, there's a convention around what news is and how it's presented and what time frame it's produced in, and actually maybe that's not really a very good way to become informed about the world or understand things. As you're saying, Ahmed, it could be that actually a very well-made documentary that has actually followed some people over time and gives context is a far better way of learning about the world than the kind of 2-minute package that goes out on the evening news. So I kind of had a question about any other examples that you can think of the possibilities that could exist in a broadcaster that was really thinking about innovating, rather than kind of sticking to these kind of generic formats and conventions that we have. So yeah, I think I'll come to each of you in turn, maybe in the order that you spoke, and you can just respond to any of those or just give your closing remarks. Ahmed, do you want to start?
I don't think that, like what the question says, that privatization would make it more adventurous. I don't think I don't think that would happen somehow. The other thing is, people have found that a lot of things that have been nationalized, didn't work that well. Privatization they thought was working well, an improvement on the services, but that didn't work either. So it's not an answer. Just privatization for what? What are the? Why should they privatize? It'll just go in the hands of shareholders. I think and there's a thing that Channel 4 thinks it's a youth. It attracts the young, and they have their research which shows that. But a lot of young people are going for streaming and for online and that kind of stuff. So this is a problem for all the channels: how to retain an audience, how to capture an audience. Because when we were talking about, there were 4 channels or 3 channels, and the 4th one, now there are like hundreds. So it's a challenge for both Channel 4 and the BBC. The BBC has serious problem with funding as well, to fund programs. It's but some of the things that I had today and some of the things I've read since we got involved with this, I think those things would be great. I think if they think seriously, they should adopt some of these things to survive as a publicly owned channel, which how much difference would it honestly make to an individual if Channel 4 is privatized? Because the way they've been going now, there's a huge effort on their part to be inclusive, to move into the regions, to train people, to employ people. That's excellent, and I just hope that it is not just because of this threat of privatization. And if it is, then that's a good thing, because at least even there have been some noises from the Tories as well, saying maybe we're not going to privatize it. So I feel optimistic if that continues. The trend towards having more diverse voices, more diverse people working in the channel, and responding to that. Then it's worth keeping it as a publicly owned enterprise. Otherwise, it's just a channel like any others.
Okay, I'm going to try and reply to 2 of the things that have come up as briefly as is possible. Firstly, what happened to Channel 4's relationship with workshops? The notion of the regional workshops and how they would offer different kinds of access and program making took place in discussions with Michael Meacher of a Labour government. That government fell, and as Ahmed has mentioned, Channel 4 was set up in the new Thatcher epoch, and maybe there were mixed motives in that, but the channel tried to step into the breach and support the workshops, although across time, the lack of state support, regional, national, meant that in the end, Channel 4's workshop funding was, the money was redeployed for program makers, including many workshops, but it ceased to have a fund for workshops. The other thing was, the first question that popped up was around relationship with the arts. It seems to me that that has to be an absolutely symbiotic relationship, because that's where visions of the present change. That's where visions of the possibilities of the future occur, you know, through activities in the arts and through the work of a public representation in television. I think that it only happens very occasionally and partially at the moment, and that's where we have to put some effort and some future change, hopefully. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that participation in broadcasting is seen as, you know, this strange thing to do, and yet participatory arts are so commonplace, and that's such a, yeah, it's a very ordinary thing to do within that kind of more cultural space. Ahmed, you wanted to come back on something?
Yeah, very briefly. One of the things about the workshops was that a workshop had to have 4 full-time paid workers under the ACTT rules, and some of the money from Channel 4 was given for full-time employment of workers. Not all of them, but quite often there were like 2 of the 4 workers. So that created, and the Channel 4 itself did not say you must do this program. So you came up with ideas and said, I want to do this, and they would say, yes, we like it. So it was an incredible model, but obviously not commercially viable in that way. Thanks, you.
Tom, do you want to sign us off?
Cheers. Yeah, I've really enjoyed the discussion today. I'm really intrigued by this point that Ahmed made about this like Thatcherite sleight of hand, that the commercial pressure is inevitably driven Channel 4 away from the remit. And I think that really is the key point here, that you know, the privatisation of Channel 4 is, well, pushing back against the privatisation of Channel 4 is a must and is a bottom line going forward for us. It's a trend across all of our public services that, yeah, we're taking public money, public institutions, that all the risk, economic risk, has been taken by us, and now taking successful institutions and sticking them into all that money into private pockets. And if we want to have public services of any description, and particularly if we want to have public services in the media, then we need to fight back against it now. If there's any hope of all of these amazing ideas that people have talked about, if there's any hope of getting whoever the next Lacan is back on TV for taxi drivers, then yeah, campaigning against privatisation of Channel 4 is number one, and then we can build towards our vision of what a future focused media would look like.
Amazing. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. Thank you to you, the audience, for joining us. If you're super keen, then do tune in to the event on creating a People's BBC at 7 p.m. tonight on the MRC YouTube channel. And I hope to see many of you tomorrow at our live day of events in Birkbeck in London. Thank you.